So, humans have been messing with plant genetics since the dawn of agriculture. 9,000 years ago was when we domesticated maize, which is corn. So, artificial selection, genetic modification, these are things that are really kind of hot button topics right now, but they're really not new. The first method of genetic modification that humans did with plants is artificial selection. So you can see this is a mustard plant, and by selecting for plants based on different attributes and then culturing those over many generations, thousands, millennia, we are able to develop basically half of the grocery aisle at Publix. So you can see broccoli is the selection of flower buds. Cabbage came from the selection of terminal buds. Turnips came from the selection of roots. Kohlrabi from the selection for stems. Cauliflower from flower buds. And then kale from the leaves. So all 6 of these very nutritious plants come from wild mustard. And this just happens over thousands of years of people choosing a single characteristic to breed. And it's only called artificial. So this is natural selection, but it's called artificial because humans did it, because it didn't happen without the interaction with humans. Our artificial selection for maize has resulted in this corn plant where these seeds are stuck on the husk and they're covered in the husk. And corn cannot naturally reproduce anymore because it doesn't shed its seeds to reproduce and make new plants. So we're at the point where maize would go extinct if it weren't for humans planting corn every year. This is teosinte, which is what we believe is the most recent common ancestor of corn. And genetic experiments have shown that it would be possible to get from a plant like teosinte to corn in as little as 4 to 5 genetic mutations. So they're a lot more closely related than you would think. There have even been methods of genetic transfer called horizontal gene transfer, thanks to a species called Argobacterium. And that has shown to transfer genes from sweet potatoes. But this happens naturally without the interference of humans. So it's totally possible for genetic changes to occur naturally. So things like wheat can hybridize with other grasses to make new species of wheat and other grasses without the interaction of humans. So if these genetic modifications can happen naturally, is humans doing them any different? Is it morally or ethically different? And why shouldn't we do them if it was going to happen anyway? Why shouldn't we hurry them along? Those are just questions to pose to yourself. All right, so plant biotechnology generally has 2 meanings. It's either like a general sense of the innovations of things that we use from plants. So, for example, tree pulp becomes paper. So that would be an example of a useful product. Usually, nowadays, plant biotechnology in a specific sense is talking about genetically modified organisms. So these are the GMOs that you see all over the wrappers of objects and things at the grocery store, where they say, no GMO. But if you're eating corn, like, it's genetically modified, whether it says no GMOs or not, because it's been modified for millennia. But what they're typically referring to as GMO is a transgenic organism, which is when we have trans means across. This is when we've taken specific genes from one species and moved them to another species. And remember, horizontal gene transfer like this can occur naturally, accidentally. But in this case, usually this is done by humans for a specific reason. So in the example here, we have the transgenic modified, this is my GMO, and this would be my non-GMO. So BT is a toxin, and it is toxic to pests. So like bugs or insects or herbivores that would like damage the corn. So in the transgenic plant, they have the gene for BT added, and the yields are better because they don't have as many pests. They also don't have to use as much pesticide on these plants. On the non-GMO, the BT maize, a huge percent of the crop gets lost to pests. And so this is going to be more expensive. They're going to need to use more pesticide, which means people have to go apply the pesticides. So one question that people are asking is, could transgenic plants like BT maize, where the crop yields are higher, the prices can be lower, we're not using dangerous toxins, could these overcome things like world hunger or fossil fuel needs? So here's an example of an attempt at curing malnutrition. So in third world countries, there's often a vitamin A deficiency. And vitamin A can turn into beta-carotene, and that helps you with vision. If you have a deficiency in vitamin A, then you can end up leading to things like blindness. And in a third world country, blindness is a severe disadvantage, and a lot of people who go blind end up dying. So the solution to this was to make a transgenic rice called golden rice, and it's yellow because it's got an increased amount of beta-carotene, which is orange. And this then can be taken into the body and be used to help prevent blindness. And this was a big battle, and it's still a big battle. The cons, right, so the no GMO camp said, just planting rice isn't going to solve this issue. Why not just use supplementation? Why don't we just give these people supplements for vitamin A? It's been shown to work. It was also shown that the golden rice didn't necessarily have enough beta-carotene in it to actually help with the vitamin deficiency, that the amount of golden rice you had to eat in order to overcome the deficiency was very large. And they also questioned the motivation of the companies pushing this remedy because they were large manufacturing companies. So if people are buying their rice, then they're going to make a profit off of this. The other group, right, the pro-GMO group, said that this was going to help solve a public health crisis. They rejected their ties to biotechnology companies, even though they seemed to be there. And even their stance, both of these stances get highly politicized. So in people who don't necessarily even know what a GMO is are either very pro-GMO or very anti-GMO based on kind of the hype that's getting politicized about it. And so both sides of these got very hyped about this. Well, it's been over 24 years since the development of this project, and it has still not been fully implemented due to roadblocks with development and people in the con-GMO group fighting against the people in the pro-GMO group. So this debate still has not actually been resolved. Another biotechnology is the use of plants as biofuels. So we can take things like poplar or switchgrass that are very fast-growing plants, and we can actually use their physical biomass to turn it into fuel. So they do this by taking the cell walls of the plants, breaking them down into sugar with enzymes, and then those sugars are fermented into alcohol, which is distilled into fuel. So that would be a biofuel. And these are really cool because they're carbon neutral, because the overall carbon footprint of the growth of the plant, the amount of time it's growing, it's doing photosynthesis, which is going to remove carbon dioxide from the air. But then when you burn it as fuel, you're going to release that carbon dioxide back again. So burning this fuel doesn't actually add new carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It's just adding back what it already took away. So that's what it means by carbon neutral. So over the last decade or so, we've seen the GMO debate become this kind of public, political, social, economical, and ethical issue, where people stand on kind of two sides of this fence and throw conjectures back at each other. There's the Netflix show Bill Nye Saves the World, and he's got a very pro-GMO biased episode on there that would be worth watching if you want to. So there's a lot of stances that people take to kind of argue about GMOs, and some of them are issues of human health. So people worry that the Genetic engineering could put things like allergens into other plants that are used for food, and then people with things like peanut allergies would have even harder time finding foods they can eat. However, typically geneticists are doing the opposite, where they're removing codes for allergens and making things more allergen friendly. And there's been zero credible evidence that genetically modified plants have any allergenic effects on humans. In general, the widespread consensus is that genetically modified plants tend to be beneficial. So specifically BT, that's that toxin. Cotton in India has decreased insecticide use. And this results in a huge reduction in poisoning. So if you think about these farmers in India who are trying to grow cotton to sell, they're trying to get good yields, they're using insecticide. When they don't have to use the insecticide, they don't have to physically spray the plants themselves, which means they aren't getting poisoned by the insecticides. We see the same thing with maize, where we're seeing 90% less fungal toxins when the BT maize is used, and this results in lower levels of cancer, lower birth defects among the people who are actually farming the maize. There's been some concern about non-target organisms, so caterpillars dying by eating milkweed that's high in concentrations of milk BT toxin. The study that did this actually wasn't very good, and the effect on the caterpillars was really, really minor, and it definitely didn't overshadow the positive effect of the GMO on humans. So probably the most legitimate complaint about GMOs is this idea of transgene escape. And one concern is the idea of herbicide resistance. So a lot of crops that we want to grow and eat, we'll put resistance to herbicides in. And that way we can just spray the weeds with herbicides. It'll kill the weeds and not the crop that we want to grow. The worry is that that gene for herbicides will somehow escape and hybridize with the weeds, making something called superweeds that we can now no longer kill because they've become resistant to our herbicides. And there is evidence of this happening in 2003 with glyphosate resistance, and it escaped from an experimental plot after a windstorm. And there are still grasses in the area where they're still resistant to glyphosate. However, from that, the resulting ecological input has been relatively minor. And we take many efforts when we do GMO studies like this to make sure that the genes do not escape. So some of the ways that we do this are we make the male flowers sterile, meaning they're not going to make pollen, so they're not going to be able to pollinate a different plant. Apomixis, so that's the cloning by asexual reproduction, so again, no pollen here. Putting the genes into things like the chloroplast DNA, because the chloroplast DNA does not end up in the pollen, so it can't escape. Or even using flowers that don't ever actually fully bloom, and so the flower will self-pollinate itself only, and the pollen never actually leaves the bloom of the flower. So by doing this, we prevent the escape of things like herbicide-resistant genes by preventing pollen from being able to mix with other species of plants.